We often think of these big historical shifts, like the birth of democracy as these sudden moments.
Right, like flipping a switch.
Exactly. But the reality is constitutions, the very framework of how societies govern themselves, they actually evolve. They're shaped, sometimes quite violently, by conflict, crisis, and, well, changing ideas over time.
Absolutely. They're not static blueprints, are they? More like a riverbed, constantly being altered by the currents and floods of history. And today, we're taking a deep dive into perhaps the most famous example of that evolution, ancient Athens.
And we're incredibly lucky because we have this remarkable guide for the journey, Aristotle. We're unpacking excerpts from his work, The Athenian Constitution, specifically using the translation by Sir Frederick G. Kenyon.
And this isn't just some dry list of rules, it's Aristotle giving us almost a blow-by-blow account of centuries of dramatic change in Athens.
Yes, showing who held power, how it shifted, and getting into the real nitty-gritty details of how their government and their justice system actually worked day to day.
So, our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through some of that complexity and pull out the most important nuggets for you.
We'll trace Athens' surprising path, really, from its earliest days, dominated by just a few powerful families, towards something more like popular rule.
We'll look at the major tipping points, the crises and the reformers who seized those moments, and then we'll pull back the curtain on the fascinating, sometimes really intricate mechanics of their daily civic life.
Get ready for some surprising facts and maybe some aha moments about what it was really like to be a citizen or an official or even a juror in ancient Athens.
Okay.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So Aristotle takes us right back to the beginning. He describes a constitution that was, purely oligarchical.
Meaning power was concentrated?
Yeah, power and office were based almost entirely on birth and wealth.
And the situation for the common people sounds, frankly, dire. Aristotle describes them as palladae or hectomore,
Tied to the land of the rich, basically like serfs.
and if they couldn't pay their rent.
They could be sold into slavery. And loans weren't just secured by property, they were secured on the debtor's very person.
Wow. So your own body was collateral.
Exactly. As the source starkly puts it, they had no part nor share in anything.
Right, you can imagine the social pressure that created.
Immense pressure. In these earliest times, the main officials sort of evolved. There was a king, then they added a pole march, probably for military reasons.
Like a war leader.
Yeah, likely. And then an archon who gained increasing importance over time. These roles, initially for life, then shrank to 10 years and finally became annual.
Except for one key body, right? The Council of Areopagus.
That's the one. And the thesmathetae, the legal record keepers, they were added later too.
And this Areopagus sounds pretty significant right from the start, composed of former archons.
Which meant life membership.
Right. And constitutionally, they were guardians of the laws, but Aristotle says they actually administered the greater and most important part of the government.
And could hand down summary punishments. That's a lot of power concentrated in a few hands for life.
Exactly. And this tension, this unequal distribution of power, it persisted.
Which leads Aristotle to Draco. His famous laws came not long after this earliest period.
Draco, famous for being harsh.
Well, yes, though Aristotle focuses on the constitutional aspect. Draco did make one key change. The franchise, the right to vote, was given to those who could afford to equip themselves for military service.
Okay, so a slight widening of the circle, maybe, but still tied directly to wealth specifically, military wealth.
Precisely. And the key magistrates, like the archons and treasurers, still required significant property qualifications, even higher ones for military leaders like generals.
It's still very much an elite-run system.
Definitely. He also instituted a council of 401 chosen by lot, but only from these franchise property-owning citizens.
Interesting. And there were even fines for missing council meetings.
Yeah, and they were scaled by property class. It shows how everything was tied to your economic standing. The Areopagus continued its oversight role, but crucially,
The fundamental problems remain.
exactly. Debt slavery, land concentration, Aristotle highlights that these didn't go away under Draco.
Which brings us to a real turning point. Solon.
Right. The city was torn by severe strife, real conflict between the wealthy and the common people. Solon was appointed as a mediator and archon.
And Aristotle actually quotes Solon's own poetry here, doesn't it?
He does. It shows Solon's deep sadness at the state of things, his difficult position. He aimed to be a savior, a lawgiver, trying to find a middle path.
not wanting either side to completely crush the other, knowing he'd probably make enemies of both.
That was his goal. And his most famous act, the one that really shook things up, was the Seisachthia, the shaking off of burdens.
This sounds revolutionary.
It absolutely was. It abolished debt slavery entirely, canceled all debt secured on a person's body.
It's hard to overstate the impact of that, freeing people from actual bondage just because of debt.
Massive.
Oh.
Now, Aristotle does mention some controversy, accusations that maybe some people, perhaps even Solon's own friends, profited by clearing their debts just beforehand.
Interesting detail.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, a huge step. What else did Solon do? Did he change the class system?
He kept the division of citizens into 4 property classes based on agricultural output. You had the Pentecosia Medimni at the top, then knights Zeugetae, and the lowest, the Thetes.
And who could hold office?
The top 3 classes were eligible for most magistracies based on their wealth rating. The Thetes, however, were only given a place in the assembly and the law courts.
Okay, so not eligible for the top jobs, but crucially, they now had a voice and a role in these 2 fundamental parts of government.
That's a key point. Even though they couldn't hold high office, they were now participants. Aristotle notes how ingrained this was. Even in his day, nobody running for office would admit to being a Thete.
Huh. Shows how status mattered. Did he change how officials were chosen?
Yes, significantly. Instead of appointment by the Areopagus, the 9 archons started being selected by lot from candidates pre-selected by each tribe.
So, introducing an element of random chance into selecting leaders.
Right. He kept the 4 traditional tribes, but reorganized them administratively. He also set up a new council of 400, 100 from each tribe.
And the Areopagus, what was its role now?
Solon reaffirmed its duty to guard the laws and constitution. It still had powers to watch over state affairs and punish offenders. And interestingly, he introduced the idea of impeachment for trying to overthrow the state.
He also had that striking law about civil strife, didn't he?
Yes. Anyone who didn't take up arms with either party during a civil conflict would lose their rights as a citizen. It basically forced participation.
No sitting on the fence in Solon's Athens.
Pretty much. Looking back, Aristotle identifies 3 things in Solon's work as the most democratic: getting rid of debt slavery, the right for anyone to initiate a lawsuit, and including the Thetes in the assembly and courts.
Plus standardizing weights and measures. Seems like comprehensive reform. Did it bring peace?
Not immediately, no. After Solon left Athens, apparently to avoid pressure to constantly change his laws, the city remained, as Aristotle says, torn by divisions.
So the underlying tensions were still there.
Absolutely. Debt issues, the constitutional changes themselves, and personal rivalries among the elite. This era saw the rise of 3 distinct factions, named after their geographic areas.
Like the shore, the plain, and the highlands.
Exactly. The shore, led by Megacles, was sort of moderate. The plain, under Lycurgus, was more oligarchical. And the highlands, led by Pisistratus, was seen as the extreme Democratic Party.
And Pisistratus is the one who ends up taking power, isn't he?
He is. He was popular, seen as a Democrat, a war hero. He cleverly engineered a situation where he claimed he'd been attacked.
And got the assembly to grant him a personal bodyguard.
Right, and using that force, the club bearers, he seized the Acropolis and became tyrant about 3 decades after Solon's reforms.
Even Solon himself saw it coming.
He did. Aristotle recounts Solon, even in old age, opposing the bodyguard request, saying he was wiser for seeing Pisistratus' aim and braver for speaking out. He even carried his armor outside in protest.
A powerful image.
Yeah.
Was Pisistratus' rule just brutal tyranny?
Actually, Aristotle describes his first period as relatively constitutional, more like a managed government than outright oppression. But he was expelled twice.
So it wasn't smooth sailing for him either.
Not at all. His final return involved building wealth abroad, hiring mercenaries, and winning a military victory. He famously disarmed the population after getting them to parade fully armed.
Tricky. What were his policies like as tyrant?
Quite strategic, actually. He encouraged people to stay in the countryside, focused on farming. He even set up traveling local justices to settle disputes out there.
Why do that?
Well, it kept people busy, scattered, and less likely to gather in the city and cause trouble. He also imposed a tax, 1/10 on produce, boosting state revenue.
Did he respect the laws at all?
He made a point of seeming to. Aristotle tells an anecdote about him appearing before the Areopagus when charged with homicide, though the prosecutor conveniently didn't show up.
Ah, so maintaining a facade of legality, was he popular?
Surprisingly, yes, to a large extent. Aristotle notes he held power for a long time and regained it easily because he mingled with people, offered financial help, and his rule was considered relatively mild, especially compared to later tyrants.
So complex figure. How did his rule end?
He died naturally after a long period in power. His sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, took over, trying to continue his system.
Hippias was the main political leader.
Yes, but it was the personal drama involving Hipparchus and the younger, headstrong brother Thessalus that led to disaster.
What happened there?
Thessalus insulted the sister of a young man named Harmodius after being romantically rejected. This sparked an assassination plot by Harmodius and his lover, Aristogaton.
They were aiming for Hippias, the leader.
That was the plan, but they thought they'd been betrayed and acted prematurely, ending up killing Hipparchus instead.
And Aristotle corrects a common story about this.
Yes, he debunks the idea that Hippias disarmed the Panathenaic procession while searching for assassins. Aristotle points out people didn't carry arms in processions back then. That custom came later, under the democracy.
Okay, so Hipparchus is dead. How does Hippias react?
His brother's death changed everything. Hippias became paranoid, distrustful. His rule grew much harsher: executions, banishments. The tyranny became genuinely oppressive.
And this created an opportunity for the exiles.
It did. Athenian exiles, led by the prominent Alcmenidae family, kept trying to return by force but failed initially.
But they got help from Delphi, didn't they?
Right. They took a contract to rebuild the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and used some funds, apparently, to bribe the Pythia, the oracle.
So the oracle started telling the Spartans to free Athens.
Repeatedly,
Huh.
Sparta, despite having been friendly with the tyrants, eventually felt compelled to act. After one failed attempt, their king Cleomenes came with a bigger army.
And they defeated Hippias' forces.
Yes, besieged him on the Acropolis. The end came quite suddenly when the tyrant's children were captured trying to escape.
Ah, leverage.
Exactly. Hippias surrendered, securing safety for himself and his family in exchange for leaving Athens for good. And that was the end of the tyranny, about 17 years after Pisistratus died.
So freedom at last. But what came next? Was it straight to democracy?
Not quite. A power struggle immediately broke out between Isagoras, who was more aligned with the old oligarchy and the tyrants, and Cleisthenes from that Alcmenidae family.
Cleisthenes. He's a key figure, isn't he?
Hugely important. When he seemed to be losing the political battle in the traditional aristocratic clubs, he made a really bold move.
What did he do?
He appealed directly to the people, gave franchise to the masses, essentially empowering the ordinary citizens.
And that worked.
Instantly made him the popular leader. Isagoras panicked and called on his Spartan friend King Cleomenes again.
Using some old pretext against Cleisthenes' family.
Exactly, the old pollution charge against the Alcmenidae. Cleisthenes wisely withdrew temporarily, and Cleomenes came and expelled 700 families associated with him.
But Cleomenes pushed too far. He did. He tried to dissolve the existing Athenian council and set up Isagoras and 300 oligarchs as the supreme rulers.
And the Athenians resisted.
The council refused. The ordinary people rallied to their defense, flocked together, and actually besieged Cleomenes and Isagoras on the Acropolis.
Wow, the people fighting back directly.
It was a decisive moment. After just a couple of days, Cleomenes and his Spartans were forced to leave. Cleisthenes and the other exiles were recalled. The people clearly trusted him now.
So Cleisthenes comes back with huge popular support. What does he do with it?
He introduces further really far-reaching democratic reforms a few years later. His most significant change was completely reorganizing the citizen body.
Getting rid of the old 4 tribes.
Yes, replacing them with 10 new tribes, deliberately designed to mix up the population. The goal was to break the power of the old aristocratic kinship groups and regional factions.
How did that work in practice?
Citizens were now officially identified by their deme name, their local village or district, rather than their father's name or clan. That became the standard way Athenians referred to each other.
So shifting identity from family to locality.
Exactly. He also created new local officials, the martroges, and the demes themselves became the fundamental administrative units, replacing older structures. It really decentralized things.
Aristotle says this made the Constitution much more democratic than even Solon's.
Definitely. Especially since Solon's laws had been neglected during the tyranny. Cleisthenes enacted new laws specifically aimed at securing the goodwill of the masses.
And one of those was ostracism.
That's right. A really interesting mechanism. It was basically a way for the assembly to vote to banish a powerful individual for 10 years without trial if they seemed like a potential threat to the democracy like Pisistratus had become.
A safety valve against future tyrants. Was it used right away?
Interestingly, no. It was passed as a law, but the first actual ostracism didn't happen for years, only after the victory at Marathon, when Athenian confidence was high.
And the first person ostracized was?
Hipparchus, a relative of the former tyrant Pisistratus. It shows that fear of tyranny was still very real.
What other changes did Cleisthenes bring?
Around this time, another crucial change happened. The 9 archons, who had been elected by vote since the tyranny ended, started being selected by lot again, from candidates put forward by the demes.
Back to random selection for those key positions.
A very democratic move. Over the next few years, ostracism was used against others seen as too powerful, even those not connected to the tyrants.
And this is also when Themistocles comes into the picture.
Yes, right around then. A huge amount of silver was discovered in the mines at Maronia. People wanted to just distribute the windfall.
Like a citizen dividend.
Sort of, but Themistocles persuaded them not to do that, but instead to invest the money in building a massive fleet of warships, the triremes.
The fleet that would be crucial against the Persians.
Absolutely vital at Salamis. Aristides, another major figure, was actually ostracized around this time too. Eventually, with the threat of Xerxes' invasion looming, all the ostracized individuals were recalled.
So after the Persian Wars, Athens is victorious, more democratic thanks to Cleisthenes. What happens next?
Well, something quite unexpected according to Aristotle. The Areopagus Council, the old aristocratic body that had lost power under Solon and Cleisthenes.
It made a comeback.
Sort of, not through any formal law change, but it gained significant prestige and influence.
Whoa.
Because of the Persian Wars themselves. Particularly before the Battle of Salamis, when the generals were apparently panicking, the Areopagus stepped up. They provided funds to pay the naval crews, essentially getting the men onto the ships that won that critical battle.
So moral authority earned through crisis leadership.
Exactly. And for about 17 years after the wars, Aristotle says Athens was well administered, with the Areopagus holding considerable sway. Athens itself was becoming the dominant power in Greece, leading the Delian League.
Guided by leaders like Aristides and Themistocles.
Right. Aristides handled the finances, assessing tribute for the allies. Themistocles kept pushing Athens towards being a naval power.
He famously advised them to focus on the city and the sea.
Yes, arguing they could earn their living through military service, garrisons, public affairs, all funded by the empire they were building, quit the countryside, basically, and become a maritime state.
And the people took his advice.
They did. And as Athens treated its allies more like subjects, the resources flowed in. This allowed the democracy to start supporting a huge number of its citizens through public pay.
Aristotle gives some incredible numbers here, doesn't he?
Staggering numbers. Thousands serving as jurors, council members, guards, magistrates at home and abroad, soldiers, sailors, something like 20,000 people supported by tributes, taxes, contributions.
So the empire essentially funded mass participation in the democracy.
It became a crucial economic backbone. But this period of Areopagus influence didn't last forever.
No, it gets challenged again.
By Ephialtes, a popular leader known for his integrity, who launched a direct attack on the Areopagus's powers.
How did he do that?
First, he used lawsuits to politically damage and discredit many individual members. Then, through decrees in the Council of 500 and the Assembly, he stripped the Areopagus of almost all the powers it had regained.
Where did those powers go?
Transferred to the Council of 500, the Assembly, and the popular law courts, basically, back to the more democratic bodies.
And Themistocles was involved in this too.
Reportedly, yes. Aristotle suggests Themistocles, fearing his own trial before the Areopagus, helped Ephialtes undermine it.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. What happened to Ephialtes?
Not long after this major power shift, he was assassinated. It shows just how high the stakes were in Athenian politics.
So Ephialtes' reforms further democratize Athens, but what's the impact?
Well, following these reforms, Aristotle notes the administration became, in his words, more and more lax.
Why was that?
With the Areopagus's oversight reduced, leadership focused more on winning popular favor, perhaps less on strict adherence to laws or long-term stability. Rivalry among politicians intensified.
And the Peloponnesian War must have added pressure.
Immense pressure. Citizen soldiers suffered heavy losses, particularly the hoplites, exhausting the best men from all classes, as Aristotle puts it.
And this affected leadership.
It seems so. Generals were sometimes chosen more for political standing than military skill, leading to costly mistakes. Less attention was paid to upholding laws amidst the chaos of war.
Were there any constitutional changes during this period?
Yes, a significant one about 5 years after Ephialtes' death, the Zeugite, that third property class.
They became eligible for archonship.
Exactly. They could now be selected by lot for the 9 archons. Before, it was only the top 2 wealthiest classes, so high office opened up to a broader group.
Any other key changes?
Local justices were reestablished, and then there's Pericles' famous citizenship law.
Ah, yes, restricting citizenship. Why did he do that?
Aristotle suggests it was because the citizen body had grown very large. Pericles' law required both parents to be citizens for someone to gain Athenian citizenship themselves, a significant tightening of the criteria.
Pericles really dominates this next phase, doesn't he?
He does. Under him, Aristotle says the constitution became still more democratic. He continued focusing on sea power, further reduced the Areopagus' influence, really cementing the masses' control.
And the Peloponnesian War reinforced this reliance on the state.
Yes, with many citizens shut in the city, reliant on military service and public pay, Pericles is also credited with introducing pay for jury service.
Which Aristotle didn't entirely approve of.
No, he suggests it attracted, well, maybe less qualified or more easily swayed common people to the juries, and argues it opened the door to bribery in the courts. He claims Amytas was the first to successfully bribe a jury.
So after Pericles' death, things take a turn.
A marked decline, according to Aristotle, in the character of popular leaders. Figures like Cleon rise.
Cleon the Tanner.
That's him. Aristotle accuses him of using unseemly shouting and coarse abuse on the speaker's platform, of wild undertakings, essentially pandering to the crowd rather than leading responsibly. A stark contrast to earlier leaders.
And this trend continued.
Apparently so. Leaders followed who just tried to give the majority whatever it wanted. People like Cleophon, the lyre maker, promising handouts.
Like the 2 obol theater donation.
Right, and then Callicrates immediately promising 3 obols. Though Aristotle notes that people eventually turned against these figures, despising those who tried to beguile them.
He contrasts them with someone like Thermes.
Yes, presenting Thermes as more moderate, willing to work within different systems as long as they weren't illegal, but an enemy of outright lawlessness, a complex, adaptable figure.
So these internal political struggles, combined with the ongoing war, it doesn't sound stable.
It wasn't. It eventually led to disaster. After the catastrophic defeat in the Sicilian expedition, Athens' position weakened dramatically.
And they were forced to deal with Sparta and Persia.
Yes. And there was a belief, maybe pushed by oligarchic factions, that the king of Persia would be more likely to ally with Athens if it had an oligarchy, not a democracy.
So they were persuaded to abolish the democracy.
Incredible as it sounds, yes. Through a complex process involving committees, they established the oligarchy of the 400.
Who were these 400?
Initially, a council of 400 selected from citizens over 30 who appointed magistrates and basically ran everything.
Was there any broader participation?
Nominally, there was supposed to be a body of 5,000 citizens sharing power, but Aristotle says this was just on paper. In reality, the 400 and their appointees held all the power. They tried to make peace with Sparta, but failed.
How long did this oligarchy last?
Not long at all, only about 4 months.
What caused its downfall?
Military defeats, crucially the loss of Euboea, which was Athens' breadbasket. This caused huge popular indignation, and the 400 were overthrown.
And power went back
To that body of 5,000 citizens, those who could afford military equipment. Pay for public office was abolished during this phase. Figures like Theramenes, who had disapproved of the 400's extremism, were key in this restoration.
So democracy restored again, but was it stable?
Aristotle suggests not really. He describes the administration again becoming more lax, blaming the influence of demagogues.
And there were serious problems, weren't there? Miscarriages of justice.
Yes, notoriously the collective condemnation and execution of the generals after the naval victory at Arginusae. The people were apparently misled.
And refusing peace offers.
Right, Cleophon, apparently drunk, persuaded the assembly to reject a Spartan peace offer. This period of mismanagement and poor decisions culminated in the final, devastating naval defeat at Aegospotami.
Which left Athens defenseless.
Exactly. The Spartan commander Lysander captured the city and imposed a new government, the infamous 30 Tyrants.
Set up by the Spartans.
Appointed directly by Lysander. They immediately ignored existing laws, installed their own loyal council and officials, and used a force of 300 whip-bearers to maintain control.
Did they pretend to be legitimate?
Initially, yes. They
Yeah.
claimed they were restoring some ancient constitution, repealing laws they didn't like, claiming to clarify others. but it was just a facade.
And Thermines opposed them too.
He did. He argued for including more citizens, criticizing the idea of ruling by force with such a small group. He pointed out they were actually weaker than the population they were trying to control.
Did they listen?
Not at all. They ignored him, grew increasingly brutal. They delayed publishing the list of 3,000 citizens who were supposed to share power, then passed laws allowing them to execute anyone not on that list.
Targeting their opponents.
Explicitly. They went after those who'd opposed the earlier 400 oligarchy, which led directly to Thermines himself being executed.
So the tyranny became outright terror.
Absolutely. They disarmed everyone except their favored 3,000, executed prominent citizens, ruled through fear. They even got a Spartan garrison under Polybius installed on the Acropolis to prop them up.
But even this brutal regime didn't last.
No. Athenian exiles rallied again, led by Thrasybulus, and seized the Piraeus fortress of Munichia.
And the tide turned.
Yes. The exiles' forces gained momentum. The general populace defected from the 30 side in the city.
So the 30 were deposed.
The party in the city deposed the original 30 and elected a new group of 10, known for being more moderate, specifically to negotiate.
And this led to reconciliation.
It did. The famous Treaty of Reconciliation was agreed. It allowed those who had supported the 30 to relocate to Eleusis and set up their own self-governing community there, keeping their property.
But the key part was the amnesty.
Crucial. A general amnesty, a deliberate forgetting of past wrongs. It applied to everyone except the 30 themselves and their key enforcers, who could still be held accountable if they submitted accounts.
And one figure, Archinus, was important here.
Very. Aristotle highlights his statesmanship. First, he cleverly limited the time people had to register to move to Eleusis, forcing many hesitant citizens to just stay in Athens and reintegrate.
And second.
When one of the returned exiles immediately tried to prosecute someone in violation of the amnesty, Archinus had him summarily executed without trial.
That sounds incredibly harsh.
It does, but Aristotle presents it as a necessary, albeit tough, move. It served as a stark example that the oaths of reconciliation had to be respected, preserving the fragile peace and the restored democracy.
Aristotle really praises the Athenians for this whole process, doesn't he?
He calls their conduct most unprecedentedly admirable and public-spirited. They consciously chose to blot out the memory of the Civil War.
Even paying the 30s war debts.
Yes. Instead of making the oligarchic faction pay its own debts, the restored democracy paid them from the public purse, believing it was necessary for harmony. Aristotle contrasts this sharply with other states that usually resorted to land redistribution and score settling after civil wars.
A remarkable commitment to unity.
Truly extraordinary. A final reconciliation with the Eleusis group happened 2 years later, bringing everyone back together. And this leads us to the constitution that was in place when Aristotle was writing.
The end point of this long, turbulent journey.
Right. Aristotle lists this as the result of the 11th major change. He counts the 10 prior forms, from the mythical beginnings through Draco, Solon, Pisistratus' tyranny, Cleisthenes' reforms, the Areopagus period, its overthrow, the 400, the restored democracy after that, and the 3010. The final form is the democracy restored after the return from Piraeus.
A system where the people had finally secured control through their own struggles.
Yes, and in this system, to ensure participation, especially in the assembly, pay for attendance was introduced and gradually increased over time, eventually reaching 3 obols per meeting.
Okay, so that's the incredible historical journey. Now let's dive deeper into the mechanics. How did this final version of Athenian democracy, the one Aristotle observed, actually work day to day? It sounds complex.
It really was in many ways. Let's start with just becoming a citizen.
All right, who got to be a citizen?
Citizenship was based on birth. Crucially, both parents had to be citizens. At 18, young men were presented to their local deme, their district.
And the deme members voted.
Yes, they took an oath and voted on whether the young man was genuinely 18 and free-born according to law.
What if they rejected him?
He could appeal to a popular law court. If the court upheld the rejection, the state could actually sell him into slavery.
Wow, high stakes.
Very. But if the court ruled in his favor, he was enrolled. The main council of 500 also reviewed the lists later, finding any deme officials who'd enrolled someone underage.
Okay, so once you're enrolled, what happens? Military training.
Exactly. You became an ephebos, a youth undergoing 2 years of intensive military training. Guardians were appointed, and a director elected by the main assembly oversaw the program.
What did the training involve?
The first year involved touring temples, garrisoning the Piraeus port fortifications, and training in heavy armor, archery, javelin, even catapult operation. The state paid them and provided their food.
And the second year?
A big military display where they received their state shield and spear. Then they spent the year patrolling the countryside and border forts. They wore a specific military cloak and were exempt from taxes and most legal actions during these 2 years.
So fully dedicated to becoming soldiers and citizens.
Right. After those 2 years, they joined the main body of citizens.
Okay, so you're a citizen. How did people get into public office? Was it all elections?
Actually, no. The Athenians use a fascinating mix of selection by lot and election by vote.
Lot, like drawing names out of a hat.
Pretty much, yes. Most ordinary administrative roles, the vast majority of magistracies, were filled by lot.
Why do that?
The idea was that it was the most democratic method, preventing influence peddling or the rich dominating everything. Any eligible citizen had a chance.
But not all roles were by lot.
No. Crucial positions, especially those involving significant finances or military command, were filled by election by voting.
Yeah.
The military treasurer, the commissioners managing the Theoric Fund for public festivals, the superintendent of springs, and crucially, all military officers, generals, cavalry commanders, infantry commanders.
That makes sense. You'd want experienced people in charge of the army and the money.
Presumably. And there was a shift over time, Aristotle notes, for some lot-based roles, moving from selection within the small deme to selection within the larger tribe, possibly to reduce local bribery or manipulation.
And people got paid for holding office.
Yes, many did. We mentioned pay for assembly attendants and jurors. Council members got paid. The praetines, the rotating council presidency, got extra. The archons, various commissioners, even officials serving abroad. It enabled poorer citizens to participate.
Were there limits on how often you could serve?
Yes. For most non-military offices, you could generally only hold that specific position once in your lifetime.
Only once.
Generally. The main exception was the Council of 500. You could serve on that twice. Military offices, however, could be held multiple times. Understandable, given the need for experience there.
Okay, let's talk about the big institutions. The Council of 500 sounds central.
It absolutely was. 50 citizens chosen by lot from each of the 10 tribes, serving for a year. The 50 from each tribe took turns acting as the prytany, the standing committee, for about a tenth of the year.
And their main job was?
Preparing the agenda for the main assembly. This was called probuluma. Crucially, the assembly could not vote on anything unless the council had considered it first and put it on the agenda.
A check on the assembly's power, then.
A very important one. They also oversaw the Navy's ships and dockyards, supervised public buildings, checked for fraud, and generally cooperated with many other magistrates.
Did they have judicial powers?
They used to have quite significant ones, fines, imprisonment, even death sentences. But Aristotle notes they lost their final authority after a specific case involving someone named Lysimachus.
So their decisions could be appealed?
Yes, to the popular law courts. They still had important scrutiny functions, though examining magistrates, especially those handling money, and vetting candidates for future office, but, again, subject to court appeal.
What about the Areopagus? What was left for it to do after Ephialtes?
It retained a very specific, though highly prestigious judicial role. It heard only cases of willful homicide, wounding with intent to kill, fatal poisoning, and arson, the most serious violent crimes.
So a specialized high court for murder.
Essentially, yes. Still composed of former archons, serving for life.
Beyond these councils, there was this huge array of other officials, wasn't there? Many chosen by lot.
A complex web. You had 10 treasurers of Athena managing temple funds, 10 commissioners for public contracts, polete, who auctioned off state leases for things like mines and tax collection.
Who collected the money?
10 receivers general, apodecte, chosen by lot. They took in payments, reported defaults. They had real power to pursue debtors.
And keeping track of all this. Accountability.
Absolutely crucial. 10 auditors, logiste, and 10 examiners of accounts, euthuni, with assistants. Their job was to scrutinize the accounts of every magistrate at the end of their term and bring charges for mismanagement or corruption before the courts, a major check on power.
We mentioned military officials were elected. What about others?
Lots chosen by lot. City commissioners, astinomi, handled an amazing range of things, checking on street musicians, sewage disposal, building regulations, even removing corpses left in the street.
Wow. What else?
Market commissioners, agronomy, ensuring goods sold were pure and legal. Commissioners of weights and measures, metronomy, checking for fair scales. Corn commissioners, pseudophalaces, overseeing the vital grain supply, prices, and imports.
It sounds incredibly regulated.
It does. You also had the 11 responsible for prisons and executions. Various boards of introducers, Eiseggeist, who brought specific types of cases to the courts within set time frames. And the 44 from each tribe, chosen by lot, handled most smaller private lawsuits, often referring bigger ones to public arbitrators first.
Okay, let's zoom in on the 9 archons. Still important figures, even if chosen by lot.
Yes, though their powers were different from early times. First, they had to pass a scrutiny, the dokimasia, before taking office.
What did that involve?
A series of quite personal questions before the council, and potentially the courts. Are your parents citizens? Where are your family tombs and shrines? Do you treat your parents well? Have you paid your taxes? Done your military service? People could bring accusations. It was a real vetting process.
Assuming they pass, what did the chief archon do?
The archon eponymous, who gave his name to the year, handled matters concerning family law, inheritance, heiresses, orphans, adoption. He assigned sponsors, chiregi for dramatic festivals, oversaw major processions like the Dionysia. He brought specific family-related cases to court.
And the king archon, Basilius.
He retained responsibility for most religious matters, overseeing the mysteries, major festivals like the Lanian Dionysia, ancestral sacrifices. He handled impiety cases, disputes involving priests, and, crucially, all homicide trials.
Homicide went to him, not the Areopagus.
He presided over the different homicide courts. The Areopagus handled intentional killing, but other courts like the Palladium, unintentional killing, Delphinium, justifiable homicide, and Ferrato, for exiled killers accused again, fell under his remit, though the actual judgment was often by a board called the Ephete. He also presided over bizarre trials against inanimate objects or animals that caused death.
Seriously? Trying an animal?
Apparently so. With the Tribe Kings, the Polemarch, the third main archon.
His role was originally military, right?
Yes, but now he primarily handled legal matters involving non-citizens, the resident aliens, or medics. He oversaw sacrifices related to war and military figures, but his main job was introducing private cases involving medics to the courts, similar to what the Archon did for citizens.
And the other 6 archons?
The Thesmatheta. Their main role was judicial administration. They presided over many types of public lawsuits, like treason, bribery, illegal proposals, oversaw the examination of magistrates, managed the allocation of courts to different magistrates by lot, ratified treaties, and brought perjury cases from the Areopagus. They also supervised the drawing of lots for jurors.
So, a huge amount of legal machinery managed by these 9 officials. Any other key roles we should mention?
Well, the Athletes, commissioners chosen by lot for a 4-year term to manage the great Panathenaic Games, the Hieropoe, commissioners for public worship and sacrifices, and various clerks, including one elected to read documents aloud in the assembly and council.
It's an incredibly detailed system. Let's talk about the jurors, the dikastai. How did that work? It sounds central to the democracy.
Absolutely central. And the selection process Aristotle describes is mind-bogglingly complex, clearly designed to prevent bribery and ensure randomness.
How did they even choose who served on a given day?
Okay, deep breath. Citizens over 30 who were eligible put their name forward. Each had a small wooden or bronze ticket, Pinakion, with their name, deme, and an assigned letter, A to K, representing jury sections.
Right.
On days courts were sitting, those wanting to serve would go to specific entrances at the courthouse corresponding to their tribe. Officials would randomly draw letters using a machine called a clariterion. If your section's letter was drawn for your tribe, you were potentially in.
Potentially.
Yes. Then they used another lottery with black and white dice to confirm exactly which individuals from the selected sections would serve. Those chosen received a token or staff matching the letter and color of the court they were assigned to for that day.
So multiple layers of random selection just to get into a court.
Exactly. It made it incredibly difficult to know in advance who would be on any particular jury, let alone bribe them.
And inside the court.
Even the presiding magistrate for that specific court was often assigned by lot just for that day. And key officials within the court, like the person managing the water clock for timing speeches and the vote tellers, were chosen by lot from the jurors already selected for that case.
Layer upon layer of anti-tampering measures.
Precisely. Speeches were timed using a water clock, clepsydra, with different amounts of time depending on the type of case. Juries were large, often 500, sometimes combined for major public trials to 1,000 or 1,500.
How do they vote?
Secret ballot. Each juror got two small bronze balls, identical except one had a solid stem and one had a pierced stem.
Solid versus pierced, which meant what?
It depended on the proclamation, but usually say solid for the prosecutor, pierced for the defendant. They held the stem covered and deposited one ball into a valid bronze urn and the other into a discard wooden urn.
So no one could see how you voted.
Right. After everyone voted, the balls in the bronze urn were emptied onto a counting board. Officials counted the solid versus pierced balls. Majority won. A tie meant the defendant won.
And then they got paid.
Yes. After voting and returning their token, they received their pay voucher for 3 obols.
The sheer procedural detail is astonishing.
It really underscores how central the law courts were and how seriously they took the idea of impartial justice through citizen participation, even if it required this incredibly elaborate machinery.
It's absolutely mind-boggling when you lay it all out, isn't it? We've traced this incredible journey of Athens
From that harsh, wealth-based oligarchy.
through conflict, reforms by figures like Solon and Cleisthenes, tyranny, wars, more reforms by Ephialtes.
The rise and fall of leaders like Pericles and Cleon, oligarchic coups, civil war.
And finally settling into this complex, mature democracy that Aristotle describes.
And we've peeled back the layers on how it actually worked. The citizen enrollment, the training, the mix of lot and vote for officials, the central role of the council and the assembly.
And that incredibly detailed juror system, designed with such care to ensure fairness, or at least try to.
This deep dive into Aristotle, it really gives you a tangible sense of how this foundational democracy operated in the real world. You see the challenges they faced, inequality, factions, power struggles.
Things that still sound familiar today, actually.
Very much so. And you see the ingenious, sometimes flawed, but always evolving solutions they came up with through centuries of trial and error.
It really makes you wonder, though, in a system where so many crucial administrative roles were filled purely by random chance, by lot, how do they balance that with the need for competence or expertise?
That's a huge question, isn't it? Was the idea simply that any reasonably informed citizen was capable, especially with the checks and balances of the council and the courts? Or did it sometimes lead to inefficiency?
Or perhaps consider the opposite. The sheer bureaucratic effort they invested in fairness, particularly in the courts, with all those elaborate lotteries and procedures?
It suggests such a profound distrust of concentrated power, maybe, and a deep commitment to procedural justice that feels almost modern in some ways, even if the methods seem alien.
Definitely something to ponder, that constant tension between popular control, efficiency, expertise, and fairness. A challenge baked into the very nature of governance then and now.